In every small town, there are rules. Some are official, posted on road signs, dictated by authorities, and found in dusty legal books. Others are whispered about, the rules no one talks about, but everyone follows. And in the town of Cimmerstone, those rules are deadly. It started with a list, neatly written in flowing, inked handwriting. One cool October morning, the town's mailboxes were filled with a single sheet of paper. No return address, no explanation, just a heading that read: The rules of Cimmerstone. 1. Do not be outside after the streetlights turn on. 2. If you hear whistling past midnight, lock your doors and close your blinds. 3. Never answer the door after 11:37 p.m., no matter who is knocking. 4. If you find a coin on your doorstep, leave it where it lies. 5. Do not look directly into the eyes of the woman in white. 6. You may see a man in a dark suit standing in the town square at 3 a.m. If he beckons you, do not approach. 7. On the first Thursday of every month, you may see a red envelope in your mailbox. Do not open it. Burn it immediately. 8. If a child tells you they have seen the hollow ones, leave town for the night. 9. Never walk on the north side of the cemetery after dusk. 10. Do not ever, under any circumstances, speak to the shadow with no source. The note ended there, without signature or explanation. Just rules. Most people brushed it off as some Halloween prank, something a few kids cooked up for a scare. But the older residents of Cimmerstone knew better. For as long as anyone could remember, the town had thrived under a veil of mystery. Strange things happened. Odd occurrences were quietly dismissed, hushed up. People knew about the rules, but no one ever discussed them. At first, I thought nothing of it. I had recently moved to Cimmerstone for a fresh start. It was a quiet town nestled deep within the forested hills, exactly the kind of escape I needed. The locals were friendly enough, if not a bit off. They spoke in hushed tones, had an odd way of looking over their shoulders as if expecting something to leap out at them. But I shrugged it off. Every small town had its quirks, right? Then, the incidents started happening. It was late, well past midnight, when I first heard it. At first, it seemed distant, like the faint notes of an old folk tune carried on the wind. The sound grew louder, clearer. A slow, deliberate melody, repeated over and over again, always the same few notes. It sounded like it was coming from the street just outside my window. I stood frozen, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Something about the sound was deeply unsettling, primal. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. A drunk passerby? A prank? But the longer it went on, the less human it sounded. Then I remembered the list. Rule 2, if you hear whistling past midnight, lock your doors and close your blinds. My heart began to pound. Without thinking, I rushed to the front door and slid the deadbolt into place. Then, I hurried to every window in the house, drawing the blinds tight. The whistling continued, slow and steady, as if the person, no, the thing, outside was circling my home. When I reached the living room, my fingers trembled as I yanked the curtains closed. In that brief instant, I saw it. A figure! Standing in the street, directly under the dim glow of the street lamp. Tall, thin, and shadowy, its outline seemed to flicker, like a poor reception on an old television. But the worst part was the mouth. Even from across the street, I could see it, wide, too wide, stretching impossibly across its face in a twisted grin. And the lips! Moving in time with the whistle! I backed away, barely able to breathe. The whistling grew louder. I heard footsteps now, slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel road. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would pass. Finally, after what felt like hours, the whistling began to fade. The footsteps receded into the distance. The air felt less oppressive, less heavy. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Not until the sun's first light filtered through the cracks in my blinds. That was the first night I truly began to believe the rules were real. After the incident with the whistling, I became hyper-aware of every small, strange detail in Cimmerstone. I took the rules more seriously, even if I couldn't explain why. One morning, A few days later, I found a coin on my doorstep. It was old, weathered, its edges worn down by time. The face was unlike any currency I'd ever seen, no country, no insignia. Just a blank, smooth surface on one side and an odd, spiraling pattern on the other. It immediately set me on edge. The rules flashed through my mind. Rule 4, if you find a coin on your doorstep, leave it where it lies. I hesitated, staring down at the coin. The rational part of me wanted to pick it up, examine it more closely. But a stronger, instinctive part urged me to step away, to leave it. So, I did. That evening, when I returned from work, the coin was gone. I never found out what would have happened if I'd picked it up. But I heard stories. Others weren't so lucky. It was a Saturday afternoon when I first heard a child mention the hollow ones. I was walking through the park when a little girl, no older than 6, ran past me. She was playing with another child, their laughter filling the air. But as she passed by, she glanced up at me, her eyes wide with a strange, knowing fear. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I froze. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The hollow ones," she replied, her eyes shifting nervously to the trees. "They like to hide in the dark." Before I could ask her anything else, her mother swooped in, grabbing her by the hand and pulling her away. The woman didn't meet my eyes, didn't say a word. She just hurried the girl along, as if desperate to get her away from me. Or maybe, away from something else. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening for the whistling, for footsteps, for anything out of the ordinary. But the night was eerily silent. When dawn finally broke, I made a decision. I had to know more about the rules. Why they existed. What they protected against. I couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for something to happen. The Cimmerstone library was an ancient, creaking building at the edge of town. Its stone facade was weathered and cracked, its windows foggy and caked with grime. The inside was no better, dimly lit, with the heavy scent of old books and dampness hanging in the air. I approached the librarian, an elderly woman with thick glasses and a permanent scowl etched into her face. She regarded me with suspicion as I asked about the rules, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. "People like you shouldn't be asking about things like that," she muttered, her voice raspy with age. I need to know why," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The librarian leaned in close, her breath hot against my skin. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing in Cimmerstone. Some things are better left alone." I felt a shiver run down my spine. But I couldn't stop now. "Please! I need to understand." She sighed heavily and gestured for me to follow her to a dark corner of the library. There, hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, was a small, leather-bound book. It had no title, no markings on its cover. She handed it to me without a word, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and fear. I nodded my thanks and left the library, the weight of the book heavy in my hands. When I got home, I opened it. Inside, the pages were filled with names, hundreds of them, written in that same neat, flowing handwriting as the list of rules. Next to each name was a date, and next to the date, a cause of death. Drowning. Disappearance. Unexplained illness. Suicide. Murder. Each name told a story. Each one was someone who had broken the rules. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the names in the book, the faces that were now just memories. People who had once lived in Cimmerstone, who had ignored the warnings. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping against my window. Tap! 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 I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned toward the sound. Standing in the street, illuminated by the faint glow of the street lamp, was a man. Dressed in a black suit, he stood perfectly still, his face obscured by the shadows. Rule 6, you may see a man in a dark suit standing in the town square at 3 a.m. If he beckons you, do not approach. The man's hand slowly lifted, and he beckoned me forward. I stared at him, my mind racing. I could feel the pull, the almost magnetic urge to step outside, to walk toward him. But I forced myself to look away, to remember the rules. I didn't move. The tapping continued, soft and persistent. I closed my eyes, waiting for it to stop. When I finally opened them again, he was gone. A week later, I found a red envelope in my mailbox. I knew what it was before I even touched it. The paper was thin and fragile, almost translucent, and it felt wrong in my hands. My pulse quickened as I remembered the warning. Rule 7, on the first Thursday of every month, you may see a red envelope in your mailbox. Do not open it. Burn it immediately. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the envelope, marched to the fireplace, and set it alight. The flames devoured it quickly, leaving nothing but ash behind. But as the fire died down, I noticed something unsettling. As the last ember flickered and died, a strange feeling washed over me. The burning of the envelope felt like a small victory, but deep down, I knew I had only delayed the inevitable. The rules were not just guidelines, they were a lifeline in this town. But each time I followed one, it felt like a part of myself was slipping away. I had grown used to living on the edge of fear, constantly aware of what might happen if I made even one small mistake. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were filled with strange, distorted images, the man in the suit standing at the edge of my bed, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, children with hollow eyes staring up at me from beneath a thick fog, coins jingling softly in the breeze as they scattered across the street. Each image felt more real than the last, blurring the lines between waking and dreaming. The next morning, I woke to find my mailbox empty. No letters, no bills, and no sign of another red envelope. But the feeling of dread clung to me like a second skin. As I left for work, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, something small and dark, lying in the middle of the street. At first, I thought it was just a rock or a piece of trash blown by the wind, but when I got closer, I saw it for what it was. This time, it wasn't on my doorstep. It was in the center of the road, as if deliberately placed there for me to find. Its surface gleamed dully in the morning light, the strange spiral pattern more pronounced than before. I froze, my mind racing. The rules had been clear, if you find a coin, leave it. But this one wasn't on my doorstep. A part of me wanted to pick it up. Maybe it was just a test, a way to see how far I would go to follow the rules. But another part of me, the part that had already witnessed things I couldn't explain, knew better. I walked away without looking back. It wasn't until the following week that I finally encountered the woman in white. I had begun to keep my head down, avoiding any unnecessary trips outside after dark. But that evening, I had stayed late at the office, trying to finish up some reports. By the time I left, the sun had long since set, and the streets were bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the empty streets, eager to get home and lock myself inside. That's when I saw her. At first, she seemed like a ghostly figure, standing at the far end of the street, her long white dress billowing gently in the breeze. Her hair was dark, almost black, and cascaded down her back in loose waves. She stood perfectly still, her face turned away from me. I froze. Rule 5, do not look directly into the eyes of the woman in white. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get away from her as fast as possible. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at her, unable to look away. She began to move, gliding toward me with an unnatural grace. Her feet didn't seem to touch the ground as she moved closer, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening for something. I clenched my fists, my mind racing. I couldn't let her see me looking. I couldn't let her get too close. My heart pounded in my chest as she stopped a few feet away. I could feel her presence, cold, suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to look, to see her face, but I forced my gaze to the ground, staring at the cracks in the pavement. She spoke then, her voice soft and melodic, like the faint hum of a lullaby. "Do you see me?" The words were gentle, almost kind, but there was something beneath them, something sinister, lurking just out of reach. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Her footsteps echoed softly as she began to circle me, her dress brushing against the ground. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I struggled to keep my eyes on the pavement. "You've been following the rules," she whispered, her voice closer now. "But the rules? they don't always save you. I bit my lip, trying to block out her voice. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension building with every step she took around me. You can't hide from them forever, she murmured. Sooner or later, they'll come for you. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, my heart still racing. Finally, I dared to look up, scanning the street for any sign of her. But the street was empty. No woman in white. No ghostly figure lurking in the shadows. I stumbled home, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally locked the door behind me, I collapsed onto the couch, my mind spinning. The woman in white had spoken to me. She knew about the rules. But what did she mean by "they'll come for you"? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That maybe, just maybe, I had crossed a line. The rules were supposed to protect me, but now I wasn't so sure. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the floorboards louder. Then, one evening, it happened. I had just settled into bed, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the woman in white was just a figment of my imagination. But then I heard it, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against the walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then the sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from inside the house. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of something moving in the corner, something tall and shadowy. My breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly stepped into the dim light. It was a shadow. Not cast by anything, but a living, breathing shadow with no source. It stood at the edge of my bed, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. Rule 10, do not ever, under any circumstances, speak to the shadow with no source. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence filling the room with a suffocating darkness. I felt its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. My mind raced, desperately trying to remember what I was supposed to do. I couldn't speak to it. But could I move? Could I run? I didn't know the answer. The rules didn't explain what to do if it appeared, they only warned against speaking to it. The shadow seemed to sense my indecision, and it began to move closer, its form stretching and distorting as it approached. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would go away, that I wouldn't have to face whatever horror it had in store for me. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty again, the darkness lifted. But I knew the shadow would be back. It was only a matter of time. By now, the rules consumed my every thought. Every waking moment was spent in fear of what might happen next. I had followed them religiously, but the town seemed to be closing in on me. The woman in white's words echoed in my mind, the rules don't always save you. I began to wonder if the rules were more than just guidelines, maybe they were traps. Maybe the rules themselves were designed to keep us in line, to control us. The thought gnawed at me, growing louder with each passing day. And then, one evening, I decided to break one. It was a small thing, really. I found another coin on my doorstep, this time, a different design, but still ancient and worn. I picked it up. Immediately, I felt the shift. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere of Cimmerstone was pressing down on me, punishing me for my defiance. My vision blurred, the world spinning around me. For a moment, I thought I was going to pass out, but then, just as quickly as it had started, the feeling passed. I stood there, holding the coin in my hand, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Maybe the rules were just lies after all. That night, I didn't hear any whistling. There was no man in a suit standing in the square, no shadow lurking in the corners of my room. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, free from the oppressive fear that had gripped me. But the next morning, everything changed. When I woke, the house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I walked to the front door, and when I opened it, I froze. The town was gone. Or at least, the town I knew was gone. Cimmerstone had changed overnight. The streets were empty, the buildings crumbling and overgrown with vines. The sky above was an unsettling shade of grey, with dark clouds swirling overhead. It was as if the town had been abandoned for years, left to decay in the wake of some unseen disaster. And I was alone. No people, no signs of life. Just me and the dead, silent remains of Cimmerstone. I wandered the empty streets for what felt like hours, searching for any sign of life. But there was nothing. The town was a husk, drained of all color and vibrancy. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind. Eventually, I found myself standing in the town square. The man in the suit was there, waiting for me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked toward him, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He stood perfectly still, his face hidden in the shadows. As I approached, he lifted his hand, pointing to something behind me. I turned and saw it. A sign, old and weathered, standing in the center of the square. The words were barely legible, but I could just make them out. The man in the suit stepped closer, his voice a low whisper in the wind. "You should have followed the rules." And then, everything went dark,